My name is Frayne Olson. I'm the crop economist and marketing specialist here with NDSU Extension. So I will try and go through a brief overview of the soybean market outlook, in particular focusing on kind of what's happening and will be happening in the next couple of months. There are some longer term issues that obviously will be impacting the soybean market, which I'll just touch on, but I'm really going to focus on the immediate crop conditions and in South America, as well as some of our export pace and some of those things that will be impacting the crop markets again over the last couple of months. So let me just share my screen very quickly here. So here's my contact information. If you do have any questions later on, I'd be happy to try and answer those. Here's my email as well as my work cell phone number. The cell phone number is probably a little more reliable, but I'd be happy to try and answer any questions you may have. So with that, let's just dive right in. So I'm recording this as of Sunday evening. So this will be information in the futures market as of the close of business on Friday. So this is the closing prices for the January soybean futures. This would be the contract that the elevators and crushing plants are using to price soybeans for immediate delivery. We kind of use that as our base pricing mechanism. Obviously, you're going to have to adjust this downward a bit for your local basis levels. The main thing I want to talk about right now is let's look at the pricing patterns over the last several months. If you notice back here in June, we had kind of a lot of downward pressure into after the spring planting and into the early summer months. And then all of a sudden we get that report that suddenly we didn't have as many soybean acres planted as we originally expected. So we had a big recovery in the soybean market. Since then, we've been bouncing around in a pretty wide trading range, but we have established this trading range. And if we look at the prices as of Friday's close, we're kind of in the middle to lower part of that trading range. And I do expect as we move into the holiday time period now, trading volumes will start to drop off a bit. There'll be kind of some light trade going on. I really don't expect any major volatility. But if we do get some kind of big shock or big piece of information or something that really turns the markets on its head, we could see some significant price movement simply because there is that thinner trade. We don't have as many buyers and sellers in the marketplace over the holiday season. So just keep that in mind. I don't expect to see any big shifts or adjustments. Probably not until after we get to the first of the year, but obviously anything can happen, especially in today's world. So we're in kind of this hovering mode right now until we get some better direction. And the two things I want to talk about is the production going on or production expectations coming out of South America, as well as our export pace. So I always usually like to start with the supply and demand tables, at least give you a reference for some of the key numbers that the market analysts and traders are looking at. So the column on the far right-hand side in red is the current marketing year. So that's the crop we just got done harvesting. The column in the middle in blue is from last year's numbers, and the column on the far left-hand side is in the green. And we're going to kind of use that as some benchmarks or some referencing points. So far, we have a pretty good idea of where we are on the production side. And I will make a little bit of a comment on yields in just a moment. The primary focus today and moving forward is going to be on the consumption side. How quickly we're starting to use up the available inventories that we have. And of course, on the very bottom line is the forecast for the carryover stocks. How much grain are we expected to have in the bin just before harvest of next year? So if we drop to the very bottom line, and I just want to set some expectations now, we look at that red number, that 245. That's the most recent estimate of how much grain we're going to have, soybeans, will have left in the system just before harvest. And if you notice, that number has slowly been decreasing. So we've been slowly dropping that number off. We've been tightening up some of our soybean stocks, which typically means we will likely have some price volatility or some activity going on throughout the rest of the winter months. I do want to make a very quick comment on the trend line yields and the yield expectations we had for this year. We have a pretty good idea what that yield is going to be, but it won't officially be finalized or locked in until January. So in this graphic, the red line that bounces around is the national average yield going back for about 30 years. That's what kind of USDA uses as their trend line. And then the blue line that runs through the middle is that trend line yield. So if you think of the trend line yield, think about that as the average yield that has been adjusted for better farming practices. The science of agriculture is getting better every year. And so the dotted line on the far right-hand side, upper right-hand corner, is the current USDA forecast. And again, we won't get the official number until January, once they have a chance to double check the survey results from farmers with some of the FSA, as well as the RMA, or the crop insurance data. Then they finalize and come up with the final number. My point being is that we did have a slightly below average yield this year, but not dramatically below. So if you think a trend line as average, we had just a slightly smaller than average yield. So most of the reduction that we had in total production, our available supplies, is really from the reduced acreage. So that does open us up then into 2024 as we get into the next marketing, or into the next calendar year, excuse me, to start talking about this balance of acres that we need. The current market expectation is we'll have a slight increase in the soybean plantings, a slight decrease in corn plantings. The main argument is really going to be revolved around how big a shift are we going to see. We know that there's going to be an adjustment. We do expect higher soybean plantings next year, likely to come mostly out of corn acres. But the real question is, how much will that shift be? And of course, that's what I want to talk about a little bit right now. So if you look at usage, thinking a bit shorter term, the two big uses for soybeans, of course, are crushing. The crushing sector, we crush into the oil and meal, and the exports. And I will come back and talk a little bit more about crush and crush demand in just a moment, but I want to focus primarily on exports right now. So again, the blue line is the crushing number, the red line is the exports number. I do want to focus on those dotted lines on the far right-hand edge, which are the current USDA forecast. Now, that's for the 12-month marketing year. So we're only partway through that marketing year right now. We will get some additional information, so they'll make some adjustments as we move forward in time. But based on what we know today, we are expecting a slight uptick. And this has continued kind of a longer-term trend for about the last 10 or 15 years, where the demand for crushing for soybeans domestically has been slowly building and increasing over time. Okay, and that's a combination of not only new plants coming online, but existing facilities that are expanding. And again, I'll cycle back and talk about that in just a moment. The one thing that is a bit troublesome, I think a little bit bothersome right now to a lot of people in the soybean market, is the exports number. Now, recognize 2 years ago in that basically at 2020-21 timeframe, 3 years ago actually, we had our record export level. That was the most soybeans we'd ever exported in our history. So to have some reduction or to have some pullback off of those record numbers is not surprising. I guess the concern we have right now is that when you look at that dotted line, this downward trend in total export levels is also continuing. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the reason for that in just a moment, but I do want you to, again, in the back of your mind, to visualize what's going on, not only in the crushing sector, a slight increase in crush, but a pretty dramatic drop in the exports. So let's get a quick summary of where we are today. This table provides a lot of information, to be very honest with you. The columns on the four columns on the left-hand side are the 12-month marketing year totals. And it's not just total exports, which you can see on the very bottom line, but this is broken down by country. So one of the things I want to really think about and talk about is which countries are increasing or decreasing or changing their purchases of U.S. soybeans. Okay, I'm going to really talk about kind of the big four. China being obviously the largest buyer of U.S. soybeans. It's not a surprise to anybody. Mexico is actually our number 2 buyer. Japan and Germany are number 3 and 4. So we have a big number 1. We have kind of a distant number 2, and then an even further distance 3 and 4. So what's happening in Mexico, Japan, and Germany, those are some pretty stable customers for us. They do bounce around a little bit every year, with the big customer being China. Now, the 2 columns on the far right-hand side are a little bit different. The column on the far right-hand side is exports to date. So we're going to go from September 1 of 2022, which is the beginning of our current marketing year, through the first week in December. So that's the most recent information we have about exports, about accumulated exports. Now, these are export sales or export commitments. So some of them have been delivered, and some of them are contracts for delivery in the future. Okay, the column right next to it, labeled 2022-23, is last year's number to date. So we can compare how are we doing this marketing year relative to last year's numbers. And again, the column kind of in this middle with this 22, 23, that's the 12-month total. This is just the year-to-date total. So we can start comparing where are we today relative to where we were last year. So if we drop to the very bottom line, 33.3, almost 33.4 million metric ton of exports this marketing year versus about 41.6 million metric ton last year. So we are behind pace. We're not quite having the export season that we did last year. And if we look at the breakdown of countries, it's really that Chinese demand that's lagging. So this year, so far, year to date, about 18.2 million metric ton versus 24.6 million metric ton last year. When we look at Mexico, we look at Japan, we look at Germany, plus or minus, they're about the same levels they were last year. But the big one that's lagging is, of course, China. The primary reason because of that is because the export season for the Brazilians has been extended. They had the record large crop last year, by far a record large crop. They have a lot of soybeans to export. Their domestic crush is growing, but not at the rate that their yields and production are. So if you have extra soybeans, you're looking to try to find a home for them. It's really the export market is the place that you have to go. So what happens because of that very, very large export volume available this year, or from last year's crop, they have been able to supply the global markets, in particular the Chinese market, for a longer time period. Okay, so they're exporting longer, which means that our export window, the place where the time period when China and Mexico, Japan and Germany and other countries come to the United States as their primary supply source, is a shorter window. Okay, and so as a result, this time crunch is very unlikely that we'll be able to really catch up to the levels that we saw last year. We might be able to extend our export season a little bit longer if Brazil has some production problems, but I'm not counting on that. And even if we do have some extended season, we're not going to be able to really pick up or gain back the losses that we had earlier on in that season and that export season. So just as a comparison, just to give you guys a vision or viewpoint for what's going on, the blue line is the amount of exports that Brazil has had. So the solid line is the existing exports. The dotted line is USDA's current forecast. The United States is the green line. Argentina and Paraguay are the black line and the purple line, respectively. So notice, really, it's for whole soybeans. Now, whole soybeans, it's really Brazil and the United States are the big exporters. The biggest importer of soybeans in the world, of course, is China, and that's the red line on top. So that would be Chinese soy imports versus Brazilian exports and U.S. exports. So as you can see, one of the concerns that I kind of have is that over the last several years, the amount of, or the rate of growth, the amount of increase in Chinese soybean imports has slowed significantly. Now, there's still some growth in their demand base, but it's much, much slower than we've seen over the last, let's say, 20 or 25 years. And so longer term, that is one of those concerns we have, in particular as Brazil starts to bring on more production. When we look at where does Brazil produce soybeans, I do want to point this out. I'm going to go through some weather and some soil moisture conditions in just a moment. We obviously talk a lot about Mato Grosso, which is this northern state right up here. That's a very large area. It's about the size of Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana combined. That produces about 26% of all the soybeans produced in Brazil. The other area that I'm watching is just to the east, which is Goiás. So notice that these two regions in the north account for about 36% of the total output, total bushels produced in Brazil. Now I want to drop down into the southern regions. So we got two big growing regions down here. One of them is Paraná, and the other one is Rio Grande do Sul. These two account for about 30%. So even though we focus a lot on this northern region, in particular Mato Grosso, which is a big important region, we can't forget what's happening in southern Brazil. So here is the planting harvesting cycle for crops. And I just want to point out soybeans. The planting season is basically ended now. We're in the reproductive and growing season. The harvest actually this year, because we had some relatively early plantings, will likely start probably in earnest about the beginning to middle of February. Okay, so that just think about the harvest cycle and the Brazilian crop really starting to hit the market in about early February. So let's look at their production, and this is their production potential and kind of where we are in a weather standpoint. So this is a drought severity map. It would be similar to, not identical, but similar to our drought monitor map. It's looking at the soil moisture conditions right now. This is really put together with a joint venture between USDA as well as NASA. So it's NASA collects all the satellite imagery. USDA compiles that into the maps that I'm going to show you. So notice the areas that are of concern. When we look at Mato Grosso, and even as we get into Goiás, as we move east into that northern growing region, this is the pocket where there's had some very dry conditions, very limited rainfall, very high temperatures. Daytime temperatures are between 95 and 100 degrees. Nighttime temperatures are in the mid 70s. So it's very, very warm up north. And this region is the area of greatest concern. Now, last year, this region had a lot of rainfall. They had a very, very good crop. Yields are very strong. It was the southern part of Brazil that had the production problems. It was southern part of Brazil and into Argentina that had the drought. Well, now let's look what's going on here. The weather patterns have shifted, and now southern Brazil is getting additional rainfall. So if anything, the planting progress in the southern part of Brazil has been held up a little bit because of wet soil moisture conditions. So when you listen to the weather, when you listen to the rainfall amounts, be very, very careful. Are you talking northern Brazil or southern Brazil? And realizing that both of those are really, really important, even though we tend to talk a lot about that Mato Grosso region. This is NDVI, so this would be vegetative health. This is how green is the crop. This map is actually departure from average. So what we're looking at is the greenness of the crop within this growing week. So it's from the December 3rd through the December 10th. And they look at the satellite imagery and say, well, how green is the crop today relative to what we would normally see this time of year? So if it's green, it's better than normal or better than average. If it's brown, it's less than average. And you can see the scaling on the bottom. So notice this area, the border between Mato Grosso and Goiás, that is kind of that hotspot area that we're really concerned about. Now, the other thing I want to point out, this has been filtered out, so it takes out most of the Amazon jungle. So this is really focused on agricultural production areas. It's not just soybeans, it's not just corn, it includes cotton and pasture land and sugarcane and all the other crops that Brazil grows. But it does give you an idea of where are those really big concerns. Now let's shift to Argentina just a little bit. So Argentina, their corn and soybean production region is kind of overlapping. It's really in this Cordoba and Buenos Aires region, some into Santa Fe. So it's really right in this central pocket or central area of Argentina. When we look at their production cycle, they're a little bit behind. They're almost a month behind Brazil when it comes to planting and harvesting. So they'll be finishing up their planting from now December into the first part of January. Their harvest will likely start probably in the beginning to middle of March. Again, a little bit ahead of last year's numbers or ahead of normal. When we look at the production regions and how we're sitting for soil moisture, just realize that Argentina is coming off of 3 consecutive years of drought. So last year, as well as the 2 previous years, they had very, very low yields for both corn, soybeans, and wheat. It's taken a while now for this additional rainfall as it came in to try and remove some of that longer-term drought problems. And we are seeing some improvement. There are still some dry pockets in this Cordoba, Santa Fe, and Buenos Aires region. So we will have to watch that, but they're having a much, much better growing season this year. So here's where we are with the with the vegetative health index. Again, I'm not going to put a lot of pressure on these maps yet, simply because they are continuing to plant. So the plants that are emerging are very small. But I do want to show, as we go through the rest of the growing season, I'll be updating these maps so you can look at them and think about a reference. So I did want to show you where they're at right now. There is still some stress showing up, but again, the plants are very, very young. I'm not expecting any major yield drag at this point. I do want to make just a couple comments about renewable diesel and renewable diesel production. So the dark blue lines are the existing capacity for making renewable diesel. And renewable diesel is really that expansion area that we're looking at. The thing that a lot of people are talking about is the light blue at the very top is what's the planned expansion capacity for renewable diesel, because that will then add a new demand base, an additional draw for soybean oil, because we're using soybean oil then to actually manufacture diesel fuel. So this is the forecasted growth rate. And one of the things I want to talk about then, if you think back to my original graphic, is so far we've had a relatively slow, steady growth in domestic crushing demand, where we take the soybeans and run them through a crushing plant to make the oil in the meal. The question we have is, we expect a growth in the crushing demand as well as demand for soybean oil. How fast is that new demand going to come on? And that's really the underlying question. Is we will see some growth. The issue is, how fast will it grow? So if you look at soybean oil only, this is not soybeans, but soybean oil. I did want to give you an idea. Over the last several years, we've had a pretty rapid expansion, a pretty solid growth rate in biofuels. So that would be both renewable diesel as well as biodiesel. It would be both of them combined. Relative to the food use, which is the blue line on top. So food use would be using soybean oil for salad dressings and cooking and frying, as well as margarines and those kinds of things. Okay, so my concern, and I just want to plant some seeds as we move forward in time. We look at this continued potential rapid expansion of biofuel use for soybean oil. I think some of these conversations about the food versus fuel debate will come back. And we within agriculture need to be prepared to discuss that. I do want to mention just a real quick comment about soybean meal, because obviously if you increase crushing for the oil, what happens to the meal? I get a lot of questions about this. Most of it right now is going for the livestock feed, which is the blue line. We do have some export demand. We currently have some exports for soybean meal. Obviously, that is going to be our growth area. I don't know that we're going to have a large enough expansion, domestic livestock, to be able to eat up all that extra meal. So we are going to have to turn to the export market to get rid of the additional meal, which again, longer term may put some additional volatility in the soybean market. So getting back to the bottom line, where are we today? I want to focus on the red bar on the very bottom relative to the other blue bars. So the red bar is the forecast for the current stocks to use ratio. We're taking our ending stocks divided by total use. So what % of our total needs will we have in reserve in case there's a problem next year? And what tends to happen is when that bar is very small or very short, we tend to have high prices with a lot of price volatility. On the flip side, if the bins are full, if we have a lot of inventory left over, we tend to have lower average prices, with much less volatility. And so when we look at the red bar relative to the blue bars, we're kind of in that, normal range is what I would say, recognizing that coming back to the 2018-19 time period, that was when we had the trade war with China and we weren't able to export anything. So if you look at the relationship, just to confirm this, between these blue bars and what happens in the marketplace, excuse me, I have the wrong slide. So let's look at what's going on right now in the January soybean market. As we think about it, what's happening now, because that red bar is relatively small, I do think we're going to have continued volatility. And a lot of that volatility is going to come from those two pieces that I just finished talking about. Number one is the export pace. Are we able to sell some of our soybeans to the export market? The Chinese are back in buying U.S. soybeans right now in a pretty big way. The question is, how long, again, will those large export sales continue? A lot of that's going to be very dependent upon the size of that Brazilian crop in particular. So I talk about Argentina, which supplies a lot of soybeans, but it's really Brazil that sells the whole soybeans and competes head-to-head with us in the global marketplace. So two things will happen if there's continued production problems, or if that dry weather and we start seeing the top end coming off of that Brazilian crop. There's two implications for that. Number one is that our export season from a time standpoint might be extended, allowing us to increase more of our old crop soybeans. but then also allowing, because of the lower supplies, there will be more demand base, not only from China, but from other countries, putting more pressure then on our 2024 crop to be able to try and backfill whatever shortages or shortfalls that occurs within that Brazilian crop. So hopefully this has kind of provided some background, some context. I do expect to see quite a bit of volatility, in particular after we get past the first of the year. We get diving a bit more into how the crop is going in Brazil, as well as what we're seeing for export pace. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and just say thank you very much for your time and attention. I'd be happy to try and answer any questions later on.